Hello, today I am going to be painting this little simple reference landscape painting in about 10-12 minutes, something like that. I'm using Art Studio Pro on an iPad, and if you use Procreate, don't worry about that. The things I'm going to say apply to both. So I've already started in the background here, and I'm blocking in the sky on its own layer. Now this might seem quite simple. Obviously it's a big block of blue, and it's very important that you get this fairly correct, because one thing you might do, which I've done many times before, is make it too bright or too light, too close to white. And I think because we always assume the sky is light, we make the mistake. And I've actually made it a little bit here in this painting too, and you'll see me adjust it in a minute. So okay, I mean, one great thing about digital is we can fix it later, right? So what I'm trying to do here, oh, by the way, I'm using a bucket fill here, which might look unusual, but basically in Procreate, if you're using it, it's called color fill. And in Art Studio Pro, it's the bucket up the top, and you can turn on lasso fill. Now, check out my other videos if you need details on those. I'll explain in much more detail how to use the tools, but it's the only tool I'm using. So I noticed after a couple of minutes of putting in the mountain that it was too high, and I'm recording this after I've painted it, and notice now it's probably still too high. So one thing, I'm not trying to match the reference 100%, so I'm not too bothered about that. Just make sure it's not right in the center where it kind of was. So I think it probably would have looked better if I went even lower. And so obviously digitally I could probably go and fix that quite easily, but I'm not too worried about that right now. So on each layer I've got the sky, I've got the mountains, and I've got the base floor. And you can see I experiment with colors and which colors to choose, and you'll see me try a few things. And I'm not trying to match the reference exactly. That's very difficult to do. Obviously, I mean, if you really struggle, you can color pick from the reference, but I wouldn't advise that, because you kind of need to learn how colors work and saturation and you know, value and things like that. So try and come up with your own colors, and you might get them really bad at first, but that's okay. Learn to use the adjustment tools then, or just try again and again and again. And it's only repetition that's going to actually make you learn how the colors behave. And because one thing you will learn as well is when you put colors next to other colors, they look different. And so it's very difficult. But one thing you need to do is just try and avoid color picking and keep on trying and experimenting, and eventually you'll get it. So once I have the blocking colors, I'll go back now over the others, and you'll see me lock the transparency. So there's a thing called lock and transparency in RStudio Pro, or there's in Procreate it's called alpha locking. Again, check out the other videos for, you know, technical details, but here we're just focusing on, you know, how to make a simple go of a fairly complicated reference in like 10 minutes. And so I'm trying to keep the details simple, but what I'm really looking for is nice values, which is, you know, how dark or light, and depth and nice shapes and things like that. So what I'm really doing in my head when I'm looking at this reference is I'm trying to look and see what's the most important thing about it. So and try and nail those. So the important things about this painting are the clouds. You know, they take up a lot of space there, and they kind of go up into the sky. Obviously, you got two big mountains and a little bit down the back. So I'd say the two big mountains, the important part. And another important part is the right side of the mountains are dark, and the left side of the mountain has grass and things on it. So I want to make sure I get that. And so the other important part is we've got lots of yellowy, orangey, greeny fields, or whatever you want to call them. And I need to get that. And one thing I think is very important is it's got some water on the right side of these little fields, or whatever you want to call them. And so I think everybody decides what's important to themselves, but if you want any sort of accuracy, you've got to take a reference and you've got to decide 3 or 4 things roughly that are majorly important and make sure you get those. Everything else probably doesn't matter a great deal, and you can change it to kind of whatever you want. So this is how I can paint a fairly complicated reference. Obviously this is not, the same style, but it's how I can paint complicated references fairly quickly. Well, I mean 10 minutes is very quickly, obviously, and hopefully you can understand or get that this is that reference and it's just in a different style. So if you wanted to nail the style, it would obviously take a little bit longer because you'd need to use brushes and things like that. But once you get to this point, going further and painting the brushes and the textures is actually not that difficult. The hardest part is nailing kind of the idea and the composition and things like that. But once you get that first, going further with just technical skills is a lot easier than you think. But if you get the kind of the major shapes wrong or the depth kind of wrong, it's almost impossible to fix after that point. So you kind of got to get it right first. So I'm working on the fields. Now, to actually copy these fields would be incredibly dull. And it'd be very, very hard to do it. And not to say you couldn't, but this wouldn't be a 10-minute painting if you wanted to. So one fairly obvious thing, or it's not obvious, but I mean to me, is that most of it is quite bright. So what you want to do though is for paintings like this, or any painting, any landscape painting really, is you want to go from dark to light. The reason is it's easy to put the highlights on top of the dark rather than vice versa. So what that means is when you put the light on top of the dark, you can actually just leave gaps to show that there's shadows now and again, because there's fewer shadows than highlights most of the time, not all the time. So the other way around would be very difficult. You put in shadows on top of things doesn't kind of make sense because the shadows are typically underneath. So you want to do the underneath and then layer on top. So one thing to be wary of when you're doing flat landscape parts like the floor and water and grass and things like that is you got to keep an eye on perspective. And you don't have to go crazy, but what the perspective really means is I'm having trouble there clearly. I'll get there in a second. I'd locked the wrong thing. So what you want to look at is it's very flat in the middle, and you kind of have just like lines down the back. It's because you can't see much because it's flattened out. Then you get a bit more kind of chunky in the middle, and then right up front it almost goes vertical. So it goes like tiny lines, flat, bigger chunks, and then lines up front where you can see the detail. Now if you do that, you kind of get like this nice perspective look. And it's in the reference, so I mean if you kind of study the reference. So it might not seem in 10 minutes, but I study the reference quite a lot. And before I start this painting, I'll look at the reference for a few minutes and kind of make a plan in my head of what I'm concerned with and what's gonna maybe trip me up and what looks difficult. And it's like, what can I do about that? And one thing that's difficult now, I'm just hitting it right now. I didn't want to cut this out because obviously most, well, I wouldn't say obviously, but lots of YouTube videos, you'll see them, and some of mine, to be fair, so I'm not going to lie, is that I'll cut out the part where I couldn't find the right color or couldn't make the right shape or whatever. So I left this in when I'm really struggling to get the highlight green at the back, and you can see me trying over and over again. Now generally, because I've been doing a lot of these paintings, that I can kind of get it in the first go or two. But what I'm doing now is maybe, if you haven't done many of these, is maybe where you're at, and it'll take you 10 goes to get the right color. And that's okay. And me showing you this is, I get it wrong all the time too. So I think I finally got roughly the right one here. So what I'm really doing though is experimenting. So you've only got a few variables with colors. So you've got like the saturation, which basically means how colorful it is. and then you've got how close to white or black is it, so how light or dark is it, and you got a couple other things you can mess with, but that's the major tool is the how light and how dark and how colorful. So what I'm doing when I'm trying different colors is that I'm changing how light or dark it is, how colorful it is, and between those two you can kind of get to what you want eventually. So maybe it's not colorful enough, or it's too colorful, or it's too light and it's too dark. So if you mess around with those, that's where it's going to get you to. So one thing that might be very confusing when it comes to color is when you are picking like the right color for the grass or whatever, you might be thinking, well, which color do I use? Now, weirdly, the color, the actual hue, is probably the least important of the three things. So you've got the hue, which is what we call color. You got how light or dark it is, and then you've got how colorful it is. So how saturated is that color. So you've got three things to go for, and the actual color, the hue, is the most irrelevant. So what's the most important is how saturated it is and how light or dark it is. So generally in landscape paintings, it's not always the case, so keep that in mind, is that the further back you go, the less dark it is and the less saturated it is. So as you go back, if you keep those two rules in mind, you'll be able to match your colors easier. Now, why matching color can be a little bit difficult is because you're trying to match the color, and the color doesn't really matter that much. So even if you change the color to something technically wrong, it'll still work as long as you get the other two right. So I've gone off on a bit of a tangent here, but I don't think I talk about color enough, and it's one of the hardest things, I think. And I think it's mainly because people are too worried about which hue it is, and that means, is it red, is it orange, is it green? And that's actually not the most important thing. So hopefully that makes some sense. If it doesn't, drop me a comment and say, what on earth are you talking about? And I'll try and explain it another way, maybe with some examples or whatever. But so you can see what I'm trying to do here is just break these big shapes down in the reference to 2 or 3 different shapes within shapes, and that is really about it in a 10-15 minutes painting. And I don't really have any more than 2 or 3 big shapes in a shape, if that makes sense. So you look at the back mountains, I've only got 2 on the right, and I've only got 3 on the left, and I'm kind of stopped there. And so what I'm doing now is add in some. So one thing you're always going to want to do, pretty much in most natural landscape paintings, is make sure you have some verticals. Now I will say 9 times out of 10 they're going to be trees, but that means like trees, rocks, bushes, houses, anything that actually just goes vertical, and lampposts, little fences, anything that just goes vertical can make a big difference, because otherwise everything kind of looks a little bit too flat. And so if these weren't in the reference, I'd probably do them anyway. And if I wanted to take 20 minutes on this, 30 minutes on this, I'd probably add a path, add some fences, some broken fences, stuff like that. Maybe it doesn't matter. Kind of up to you. So if you found this useful, give me a sub and a like, and I'll catch you in another one.